visit St. Jerome's and now St. Jerome Center. Welcome, Father John Melloh.
Thank you. Can I use one of these chairs, Mike? Good. Thanks.
Put that up there. There we are.
I'm glad to be here with you. I will go anywhere to talk about the Liturgy of the Hours. Basically because not many people will go talk about the Liturgy of the Hours. And that's been an interesting shift in my own history. One of the required courses when I was doing my MA at Notre Dame in Indiana was the Liturgy of the Hours. And it was the one course that I tried to avoid taking, even though it was required. And my experience of that course that I had got me frightfully excited about the possibilities for prayer with the Liturgy of the Hours, especially morning and evening prayer, as being very relevant for us this century. And it has become one of my real interests in matters liturgical. So I hope that I can communicate to you some of my own enthusiasm and deep beliefs about this prayer. I have developed a habit lately of reading poems and things to my students, and so I will read to you from Annie Dillard's Teaching a Stone to Talk. This has nothing to do with the Liturgy of the Hours, but it's just nice. The new Episcopalian and Catholic liturgies include a segment called Passing the Peace. Many things can go wrong here. I know of one congregation in New York which fired the priest because he insisted on their sharing the peace, which involves nothing more than shaking hands with your neighbor in the pew. The men and women of this small congregation had limits to their endurance, and passing the peace was clearly beyond the limits. They could not endure shaking hands with people to whom they bore lifelong grudges, and so they fired the priest and found a new one sympathetic to their own needs. The rubric for passing the peace requires that one shake hands with whoever is handy and say, "Peace be with you." And the other responds, "Peace be with you." Every rare once in a while, someone responds simply, "Peace." Today I was sitting beside two teenage lugs with small mustaches. When it came to pass the peace, I shook hands with one of the lugs and said, "Peace be with you." And he looked at me and said, "Yeah." We have been working at renewal in the liturgy for over 20 years. And I think that Eucharistic renewal has caught on. And even though we have some scenarios, such as Annie describes, with regard to the Eucharistic liturgy, I think that we really have not tapped the resources that we have in the Liturgy of the Hours. A tremendous paragraph can be found in this general instruction on the Liturgy of the Hours, paragraph 273. And this paragraph says that the Liturgy of the Hours, and I quote, should not be looked on as a monument of a past age, to be preserved almost unchanged in order to excite admiration. On the contrary, it should come to life again with new meaning and grow to become once more the sign of a living community. I think that paragraph is very important. It suggests that in the 20th century we need to be in touch with our tradition of prayer, but that the Restoration is not merely dragging out old forms that they used, for example, in 4th century Jerusalem or 6th century Antioch, but to be in touch with the tradition as living and moving. The question that I want to raise this morning is whether or not we really ought to restore the Liturgy of the Hours. Should we pay attention to this paragraph? Why should we bother? As a matter of fact, the Liturgy of the Hours had fallen into atrophy as communal prayer. Probably many of you, judging from what I assume to be the age of many of you, probably have not experienced the Liturgy of the Hours as being a vibrant parochial prayer form that happens weekly. The Liturgy of the Hours did not really exist as communal parochial prayer except in some communities, usually ethnic communities. And it did exist as a prayer form in monasteries up until this century. And so I wonder, just looking at the fact that it had fallen into disuse and atrophy, whether or not it is realistic to try to restore it. Is it realistic to try to take this prayer form, which has not been part of our growing up in this century, and try to restore it? We are in a position in this century, however, to be able to restore it, if we so desire, because of the work of Pius XII. Pius XII was a great man with regard to the Liturgy of the Hours, and he did an amazing thing during his pontificate. He put an end to the tradition of praying the Liturgy of the Hours in the Roman basilicas. And you say, well, that's a strange thing to be happy about. What he did during his pontificate was he put an end to the tradition which had existed since the 4th century of praying the hours in the basilicas. And he said, this prayer form is to cease and desist because it has become, quote, a scandal to all of Christendom, unquote. What had happened to the prayer form is it was no longer, as paragraph 273 speaks about it, the sign of a living, vital community. It had fallen into becoming the sheer recitation of texts, going through texts in order and without blank, without any sense of being corporate prayer. And it was done, for the most part, by canons who secured their living by praying this prayer form. Because Pius XII put an end to this, he raised a serious question as to what this prayer should be. He said, it certainly isn't what we're doing. It has to be something else. So he opened the door to examining the prayer form. What I'd like to do, with that as an introduction, is look at the Liturgy of the Hours as prayer and see if we can find therein some motivation for its restoration. And I'd like to examine some contemporary documents and note some sort of changes in approaches. And this presentation is divided basically into two parts. I want to look at two things with you. Number one, liturgy, and number two, hours. Okay? It should be easy to remember. Liturgy of the Hours, liturgy, hours. First, liturgy. The Liturgy of the Hours, by its very name, is conceived to be liturgy. What does that imply for us? It really means that, above all, it is prayer. That when we are talking about the Liturgy of the Hours, it must be an experience of prayer. And it must be an experience, if it is liturgy, of being communal prayer. And it must be, if it is liturgy, public prayer. Mediator Dei and the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy both say that what liturgy is the worship of the Church. And so this prayer, which is public and communal, is ecclesial prayer. It is the prayer of the entire Church. That statement would imply for us that the Liturgy of the Hours is, first of all, much more than the recitation of prescribed texts, much more than reciting prescribed texts. If you think about the bells of St. Mary's, which played on TV during the Christmas season, every season, we have the image of Barry Fitzgerald with his Morocco-bound breviary pacing back and forth in the schoolyard, reciting prescribed texts in order and without blank. What's interesting about that is that the rubric for doing that said that you must move your lips. You must move your lips. That was the only remnant for corporate choral office. The remnant, the tradition of praying this prayer together, i.e. a group of people coming together to make prayer together by praying the psalms together, singing hymns together, the only remnant that we had by the time of the shooting of the bells of St. Mary's was Barry Fitzgerald moving his lips as though he were trying to make corporate prayer by himself. It strikes me that the Liturgy of the Hours as liturgy has to be more than that. Secondly, the document is clear, the general instruction on the Liturgy of the Hours is clear when it says that this prayer form is not the preserve of clerics or religious. It is not the preserve of clerics or religious. That was a view that we had inherited because of the various historical quirks that took place with regard to this prayer form. I will look at history a little bit later. But the document is clear that the Liturgy of the Hours, the Constitution on the liturgy says, is to be restored to the folks. It is to be restored to the people. It is the people's prayer. It is not the prayer exclusively of clerics or religious. And thirdly, the Liturgy of the Hours is not individual prayer, but it is communal prayer first of all, or normatively. That is, the image of Barry Fitzgerald is not the normative image for the Liturgy of the Hours. That happens because of the history of obligation. It is basically and normatively communal prayer. I'd like to distinguish here between what I call communal prayer and group prayer. Group prayer means that we do something individually but in the presence of others. Group prayer. Communal prayer means we are involved in one corporate activity. The image that I like to suggest that sometimes is helpful for this is the telephone booth. Group prayer is each individual getting into his or her telephone booth and ringing up good old God. And we each engage in an animated conversation with God with the door to the phone booth closed. But we are all talking at the same time in our own individual way. Corporate prayer is we are not in telephone booths. We each have a phone, but we're on a conference call. So that we are listening in to one another. We are tuned into the experience of one another in dialoguing with our God. Fourthly, the statement that it is the worship of the Church would imply that the Liturgy of the Hours should manifest the characteristics of other liturgical acts. In other words, if it is liturgy, then it should have the same basic principles applied to it as we apply to Eucharist. Let me examine some of those things specifically to make it clear. Paragraph 28 in the Constitution on the Liturgy and paragraph 58 in the General Instruction both speak of diversity of ministerial roles. We have pretty much absorbed that principle of diversity of ministries with regard to Eucharistic celebration. The Eucharistic celebrations that we have now are enacted to that according to the principle that each person should do what his or her ministry is, but not do the ministry of someone else. There are some dioceses in the United States that don't follow that principle. I know of one which shall remain nameless, where it is the exception that one would have a reader at Sunday Mass. The presbyter still does all the readings. It is quite literally a one-man show. That is not normative liturgy. That is not good liturgy. Jesus is not happy with that. As it says in John's Gospel, and Jesus wept. But we have caught on in the main to that principle. The Liturgy of the Hours would demand the same approach, that we would respect the diversity of ministries. I was once asked to address a community of sisters about restoration of the office. And I asked them if I could come the evening before and celebrate evening prayer with them, just be with them and let them do what they normally did. So we got in the chapel was very dark, and all of a sudden I was quite startled by somebody starting this prayer. And I looked around, I couldn't see anybody. Couldn't find the leader. It was a voice out of the depths. I was even more startled when it came to the reading and discovered only by turning around that the reading was done from the back of the church building. This individual tottered out of her pew and went all the way to the back and then read through a microphone, standing about 50 feet away from where the rest of us were. And I said to myself, this is not normative liturgy. Normative liturgy demands that someone lead the prayer, and the leader needs to be visible. The leader needs to be visible. And if reading is a part of the office, then the reader needs to be visible. Why? Because it is communal prayer or corporate activity. We need to be in tune with what each is doing for the service of the body. Or some other things. Involves action. Liturgy always involves activity. In the Eucharist, we would find it nowadays quite unacceptable to be victims of the comfortable pew where we just sit, period. We'd find that unacceptable. We need to stand, we need to move, we need to process. Liturgy also involves attention to proclamation of the Word, attention to symbol actions, attention to art and environment, attention to music. And it needs to be, quote, available, unquote, to the people. Folks need to be able to enter into it. So that whole raft of characteristics, and you could multiply that litany, all of the things that apply to the Eucharist need to apply to the Liturgy of the Hours, or things that apply to baptismal celebrations or anointings. They all need to apply to the Liturgy of the Hours. Is that relatively clear so far? Good. Second thing I'd like to suggest is that liturgy manifests in symbol what it is, namely a public work. Liturgy is a work for the people. Before any of us were born, the term liturgy was applied in the Greek city-states to public works, like the waterworks. Public utilities were liturgies. They were things that were done on behalf of the needs of the people. So it was a term used in secular life. What our liturgy is a celebration of the public work that Christ Jesus has wrought on behalf of God's people. And what liturgy does is it expresses this work for the people in ritual patterns. It expresses it in ritual patterns. What that would imply is that liturgy needs shape and framework. We cannot reinvent the liturgical wheel every morning. We tried in our community. We went through the stage of, quote, creative morning prayer, unquote. Creative morning prayer was a pre-breakfast surprise. One never knew what was going to happen. We knew that we'd be there for 20, 25 minutes, and we would be surprised. Some mornings we'd be shocked by what happened. I remember one morning coming together and I saw in front of us a rusty anchor, an avocado, and a cactus. My instinct was to run. It was just to run. And I stayed there and I said, I should have run. What happened to us after we did that for a while, and we discussed it in our community, and came to the conclusion that yes, indeed, we were creative, but no, indeed, we were not at prayer. We were trying to spend those minutes figuring out what the heck is going on. And so we were not involved in something into which we could enter. Ritual is a set of conventions, that is, organized signs and gestures, which members of a community use, and these organized signs and gestures are used to interpret and express and transmit to others a relationship to reality. What ritual does is it expresses the way a group views reality. It is a way of saying who the group is. It is a way of declaring something about the group and its existence. If you take the very simple example of the birthday party, the birthday party is a ritual. There are ritual ways of behaving at birthday parties. The ritual that we have generally adopted is that one needs to have a cake. One needs to put candles on the cake. The candles need to be one for each age until one reaches that certain age. And then one can have one candle. Or you can work something else out. But you do need to have candles. You do need to light the candles. And during the lighting of the candles and the presentation of the cake, you have to engage in ritual song. And you can't change the song. You just can't change the song. And you don't recite the song. You have to sing it. Even if you are not a group of Carusos, you have to sing the song. You don't recite, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you. You can't do that. And when the lights get turned down on the rheostat, or you shut the main light off, no, the people sitting around the table don't say, geez, I wonder what's going to happen. I can't imagine what's going to happen. You already know what's going to happen. But what that ritual does is it puts us in touch with the history of the group. And it says, in non-verbal ways, something about who we are. That we are gathered at this table, or in this living room, or wherever. We are gathered because we have been called together by this person whose birthday we celebrate. And so, that ritual activity says something to us about our group identity. That's what liturgy does for us. When we come to celebrate the Eucharist, or the Liturgy of the Hours, or baptisms, or confirmations, or whatever, it says something about who we are as God's people. It puts us in touch with our past. It puts us in touch with all of the great moments and charter events that have happened. Ritual, then, is an interpretation through action of human experience. We express our relationship to reality. We negotiate our relationship to reality through these ritual activities. Even the very humble rituals that we engage in the morning, which we do rather unself-consciously and without much thought, thank God, help us to negotiate being human. The rituals of washing, putting in one's contact lenses, brushing one's teeth, all of those things. Thank God we do not have to think about those. Imagine if you had to make a will act about every one of those things that you were going to do. You'd be bananas by the time you were put together. What the ritual helps you to do is negotiate your humanness to make you acceptable to society, as well as to yourself. Ritual expresses a shared vision, and it becomes, in reality, the incarnation of a group's story. What ritual does is it grabs hold of the history of a group, that is a story, and it presents this story through representing constitutive events. And this representation of these charter events communicates force and power to the generation, which ensures its continuity in history. You say, well, that's a mouthful. I think an example will clarify what that means. A husband and wife celebrating an anniversary. What is done there is one remembers a constitutive or charter event of the pronouncing of commitments, the marriage vows. And what that does when one celebrates the anniversary is it puts us in touch with the force and power of the original event. We don't reenact the historical circumstances. The husband and wife don't necessarily go back to the same church or try to get into their wedding garments that they wore 30 years ago. My parents would never be able to do that. Or walk down the aisle or have rice thrown in their faces again. But by celebrating the anniversary through a meal or whatever, one lays hold of the story. One grabs hold of that story, and the force of the constitutive event becomes powerful, and it has the power of moving the couple into a history, into the future, in continuity with history. Have you read The Clan of the Cave Bear? It's been on the bestseller list. It's a nice story. It's a great story. It's about prehistoric men and women. It has a feminist theme running through it, which is quite interesting. The Clan of the Cave Bear talks about common memories and rites. What happens is the clan discovers this woman, Isla, who is not part of the clan. And gradually she becomes accepted by the clan. And she is very, very good in ferreting out medicinal herbs and roots, tubers, healing things, and is trained very well by the medicine woman of the clan. And the question is whether or not she can become medicine woman. And the critical question is, she doesn't have the common memory. She doesn't have our charter events as part of her memory. So she can't be with us. She can't celebrate the way that we do. And I think the book says something about the liturgical event and rite, that in order to enter into the ritual event, we need to have access to the common memory of the church. It is critical. That's the only way that we as a group can move forward. I'll give you another example. I have a friend who went to visit her niece. And Jennifer's niece had seen E.T. about 3 weeks before Jennifer got there. And when Jennifer got there, her little niece said to her, "Oh, Aunt Jennifer, do you remember when we saw E.T.? Do you remember what E.T. did? Do you remember where we bought the popcorn? Do you remember the ice cream we had after the movie?" And Jennifer was not there for any of those events. The child thought that her memory was the common memory of the universe, that what she could remember, everyone could remember. What is critical for celebrating liturgy is that those of us who come together have a common memory of the story of the tribe of Jesus. And unless we share that common memory of the story of the tribe, we can't enter into that event. Because what liturgy is going to do is activate and charge and make powerful the meaning of those charter events so that we can move into the future. Thirdly, Christian worship in ritual forms is celebrating God's action among God's people. Liturgy is not celebrating how God has touched God's people in the past, but it is celebrating how God touches God's people now. By our celebration, we may recall events in the past, but those events in the past become paradigms or models of how our God operates now. What's involved here is how we read the Scriptures. How do we read the Scriptures? Or how do we read the rituals that we perform? And there is a way of reading the Scriptures, I think, that would distance us from the Scripture. There is a way of reading, for example, on the first Sunday of Lent, any of the synoptic accounts of Jesus' temptation. Matthew, Mark, Luke. This year we have Matthew. There is a way of reading that story in such a way that it becomes a nice story of what happened to Jesus in the desert. But I think there's another way of reading the story so that it becomes a model of what is happening to the Christ in space and in time. Not just what has happened to the historical Jesus, but what is happening to the body of Christ in space and in time. 2 years ago at our parish for the Good Friday celebration, this ancient priest who was retired at the parish, and he was ancient, he presided at the Good Friday service. He's a venerable and delightful old man. And his preaching is a matter of, for him, of sacred eloquence. He preaches according to a certain style, which is not the style of preaching today. But he does have some content, which is very good. And he usually has ways of grabbing people's attention. One Sunday he began his homily by saying, "Where are the sex stars of yesteryear?" Well, that has a way of engaging people. His homily for Good Friday began, "If you think that the passion of Jesus is over, you're wrong. The passion of Jesus is taking place in our parish." There's a way of reading the passion narrative of Jesus so that it distances us and we say, oh yes, those are things that happened to the historical Jesus, but there is a way of reading the Scriptures so that we become involved in celebrating God's action among God's people today. That is what Eucharist and the hours and all liturgy is about. It is making present and available to us the deep structures that are present in God's action among God's people. What we do in the Liturgy of the Hours is retell these charter events as paradigms, as models of what is happening to God's people today. And we retell the story in the Liturgy of the Hours through hymns, through psalms, through prayers, and through intercessions. And we use in the Liturgy of the Hours the basic cosmic symbol of the sun. It puts us in touch with the universe. The Liturgy of the Hours is related critically to the passage of the sun. In the Eucharist, we tell the story in different forms. We tell it through the proclamation of the Word and the sharing of the meal elements, the bread broken and the cup poured out. In the Liturgy of the Hours, we do it differently. They both have the same purpose of putting us in touch with God's activity. Is the Liturgy of the Hours worth restoring? Paragraph 3 in the document on the Roman calendar says, each day is made holy by the celebration of God's people, especially by their celebration of Eucharist and the Liturgy of the Hours. Each day is made holy. In one sense, I disagree with that statement. I disagree with the Roman document where it talks about sanctification of time. I don't think we can sanctify time, and I don't think that the Liturgy of the Hours is about sanctifying time. I think what the Liturgy of the Hours is about is sanctifying people, making people holy. And people become holy and built up into this wondrous temple, become living stones in Christ's temple, by being in touch with the mystery of God. And we are in touch with that mystery of God in the Liturgy of the Hours, morning and evening. Second thing that I'd like to talk about this morning is hours. What does it mean to be related to time? And before I do that, I will read you another section from Annie Dillard. She writes, on the whole, I do not find Christians outside of the catacombs sufficiently sensible of conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats or velvet hats to church. We should all rather be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and give us signal flares. They should lash us to the pews, for the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return. The 18th century Hasidic Jews had much more sense and more belief. One Hasidic slaughterer whose work required invoking the Lord bade a tearful farewell to wife and children every morning before setting out to the slaughterhouse. He felt every morning he would never see them again. For every day, as he himself stood with knife in hand, the words of prayer carried him into danger. And after he called on God, God might notice and destroy him before he had time to utter the rest, have mercy. Another Hasid, a rabbi, refused to promise a friend to visit him the next day. How can you ask me to make such a promise? This evening I must pray and recite, Hear, O Israel. And when I say these words, my soul goes out to the utmost rim of life. Perhaps I shall not die this time either. But how can I now promise to do something at a time after I have prayed the prayer? Liturgy is a powerful experience. It has a way of grabbing us deep in our guts, and it has a power of moving our souls to the utmost rim of life if we enter into that experience. The Liturgy of the Hours is not only liturgy, which is powerful, but it is the liturgy of the hours. That is, it is related to time. I have a couple of reflections on time. Augustine, in his Confessions, chapter 9, talks about time, and he says, I know what time is until somebody asks me to explain it. I know what it is until somebody says, what is it? And he says, when they say, what is it, then I have no idea. I don't want to discuss with you the psychological or sociological or physical understandings of time, but rather suggest to you some images of time. It appears to me that there is an operating metaphor in United States culture, and that operating metaphor is time is money. I was driving to Chicago one day and I had this public radio station on, and they had All Things Considered. And somebody was giving a commentary on consumerism. And he said, I'm coming to the belief that the only thing that unites us as Americans is consumerism. And I thought, isn't that tragic? That the only way that we're united is because we buy things. And it struck me that maybe that's true, that we approach time as being money, giving us power to buy things and consume things. Time for us becomes related to product. How do you use time? It is not seen as gift. I'll give you a couple of examples. Schwarzenberger wrote this book, Burnout. And the thesis of the book is that people are burning out, especially business executives. But it appears to me that it's not only business executives who are burning out, but lots of other people are burning out. I have been in touch with a good number of dioceses in the United States, and one of the crises there is that people in ministry are burning out. Or Robert Schuller attests to us Sunday after Sunday that people are not blacking out, they are browning out. It's critical. There is this sense of burnout, and I think it has to do with time, not approaching time the right way. In an interesting article that appeared in Harper's, Lewis Grant comments on a story that had appeared in Woman's Day. The title of the article is Fast Folk on Keeping Up with the Gerbils. Do you know what gerbils are? Those kangaroo rats that you put in a cage and you give them one of those circular treadmills and they run around and they're very happy. And he comments in this article on the story that had appeared about Charlotte Soule. Charlotte Soule, he says, is fast folk. She is a business executive in Denver, and she works for Samsonite. She is, quote, manager of corporate financial planning and analysis for Samsonite and the luggage and home environment division of Beatrice Foods, unquote. He says, it is doubtful that she observes the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit even in the halls of that organization. And he refers constantly in the article to her work, not at the Samsonite and Luggage and Home Environment Division of Beatrice Foods, but he calls it the suitcase place. What he points out in the article is how Charlotte manages her time. It is very precise, the way that she does things. And he does it by comparing it and speaking an awful lot about William James and the will to believe. And he says that James wrote, a moral question is a question not of what sensibly exists, but of what is good. Science can tell us what exists, but to compare worths and values, both of what exists and does not exist, we must consult not science, but what Pascal calls the heart. In her article on Charlotte Soule, Mary Rogers did not consult her heart. She consulted her watch and her program. He says, to decide whether Charlotte Soule is living the good life, we must move slowly and methodically, consulting our hearts and seeing what is before our eyes each step of the way. I'll just read a couple of other things. I like this article. Instant breakfast is too slow for Charlotte. Samsonite suitcases are made for people on the go, and so is yogurt. That's what Charlotte eats as she makes the hour drive in 40 minutes, so that she can enjoy herself checking over her expense account at 7:30 in the morning. Charlotte consumes, quote, a spoonful of bran cereal stirred into a carton of yogurt which she carries in the car. Can we assume, then, that while Charlotte whips through the traffic, she is simultaneously spooning yogurt into her mouth? Let's give this busy person a round of applause. For a 10-hour day at the suitcase place, 2 nights a week, Charlotte hustles over to the Colorado Women's College to teach a course. Remember that on the other day she arrives at work at 7:30, drives 40 miles home for the dinner that her husband Chris has made at 6:30 p.m. And in the fall she plans to begin studying for her CPA and arriving at work at 6:30 a.m. Will she give up the additional income from the women's college or continue teaching there as well? What time will she get home in the fall of 1979? And what yet have we not heard about? This was to be an article about a wife and mother who was successful in business. The last thing that I'll suggest is what he says. Jogging is just a symbolic literalization of what Americans have been doing for a long time, trying to keep up with the gerbils. Speed is contagious, and as Einstein pointed out, relative. Many fast folk don't even know they're running because they don't know anyone who's walking. And the media won't acknowledge that there are such people who walk. As the national treadmill speeds up, everyone adjusts the pace so that no one is the wiser, just a little more exhausted, irritable, and depressed. Burnout, the fast folk. It strikes me that we need to look at time not as money, but as gift. That time is something which is given to us. Henry Nouwen, in his book Clowning in Rome, speaks about, quote, contemplative vision. Contemplative vision, a way of looking at the world through differing eyes. There was a fellow on the plane who was a theologian, and he was talking to a friend of mine basically because this friend of mine who wanted to remain quiet on the plane had unfortunately brought along a religious journal. I found that out. Never read things like that on planes because people ask you questions. And he found out that this fellow had been in a near crash on an airplane. There had it almost was a fatality. And he said to my friend, but now everything is different. Everything has changed. I now look at life in a new way, and everything is for me gift, because I am living on borrowed time. Time is for me a gift. Abraham Heschel comments in The Sabbath his book, The Sabbath, on time. And he says that technological societies tend to be engaged in the conquest of space, not only outer space, but territorial space, and are very much concerned about things and possessions. He says that our bodies are in space, and so they become territorial entities, and since our bodies are in space, we become rivals. Because I can't occupy the same space that you are occupying. So vis-a-vis space and territory, we are rivals. However, he says, our spirits live in time. And when we live in time, we become not rivals, but contemporaries. We become contemporaries. He proposes that space really deals with the human kingdom, territory, land, geography, the human kingdom. But time really is about the kingdom of God, or, better translation, the reign of God. Kingdom implies territoriality. And the reign of God will take place in time. It will happen in time, in the future, and it will happen in time, not in space. When we look at things spatially, we tend to dominate, divide, and construct. When we look at things temporally, we can't conquer and we can't divide. The Church, it appears to me, has tended to think in spatial terms. The Church is concerned about geography, diocese, parish, boundaries, separations. The Church, we could say, becomes real estate agent, concerned with property and its management. Or you can think today about the Church as using architectural metaphors, which are definitively spatial. What do? We set up programs. We have blueprints for these programs. Architectural, spatial metaphors. And, unfortunately, we also, quote, build community, unquote, as though we are dealing with bricks and mortar. By way of contrast, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book Living Together, says that we do not build community, that community is a given, and that what we need to do, because we are baptized into Christ, is discover the givenness. We need to discover the givenness. We can't create it. It's already been created. God already did it. What we need to do is discover it. And just that shift gives us a whole different approach to, quote, building community, unquote. By way of contrast, the Greek word parochia did not mean parish in terms of geography, parochial. What it meant was an overnight stopping place. An overnight stopping place. It never had a sense of permanence to it. Why? Because God's people are a pilgrim people, and they are on the move, and they are moving in time, and they are moving towards God's reign. We also tend to disparage time. We think of the atemporal as better. We think that, quote, eternal verities are better than non-eternal verities, things that are timeless truths. Things that don't exist in time are better. The truer they are, we would want to say, is they are not subject to change and not subject to time. It's a very Gnostic position. Or we think of time as being the enemy. What we like to do with our buildings is make them so that they are permanent and so that they will last more than a lifetime. More than a lifetime. Or one of the problems that we have today in liturgy is with the RCIA. We tend to look at the RCIA not as a process, but as a program. And what we want to do is come up with the best possible program that we won't have to change in time. But time is God's. And the reign of God is a matter of time. The Tower of Babel in the Scriptures was a delusion. The Tower of Babel was about trying to express a relationship to God through architecture. It was trying to conquer space in order to get to God. But the other image in the Scripture of the bridegroom is that of a heralding presence. And so we need to stand ready, waiting for the bridegroom in an attitude of vigil, an attitude of vigilance. Those who are awake in time and ready for when the reign of God comes. The Liturgy of the Hours is really about the sacrality of the moment. And it is about the celebration of God's reign. It is about the celebration of God's reign over all times and all seasons and all days and all hours and all minutes and all seconds. The time of the Liturgy of the Hours is not really so much related to clock, but it is much more related to events that point to God's reign. The Liturgy of the Hours has some relationship to the Jewish tradition of prayer. There were two traditions of Jewish prayer. The temple tradition, with temple sacrifice at fixed times, and the synagogue tradition of prayer. The synagogue tradition of prayer is much more related to the Liturgy of the Hours. For synagogue prayer, one needed to have a quorum. There needed to be a community for prayer. And if you didn't have a quorum, you couldn't pray. It's just like in the in the Liturgy of the Hours in the medieval period, and I'm not suggesting this as a model, but in the Liturgy of the Hours in the medieval period, to celebrate the office you needed 7 different books. 7 different books. But not everybody had the same book. You had only the book that had in it the parts that you needed to do for your ministry so that all of us could pray corporately. If you were the reader, you had the book of readings. If you were the psalmist, you had the book of psalms. If you were the antiphoner, you had the book of antiphons. If you were the leader, you had the book of collects. And if one of you, unfortunately, should drop dead on the way to coming to the assembly, the folks couldn't have prayer. Why? Because it is not group prayer, but it is corporate prayer. I'm pushing the example to exaggeration. Of course you could have prayer if somebody died. But you probably wouldn't have the Liturgy of the Hours. You'd celebrate a funeral. And these times for prayer in Judaism were times of crisis, and they related to light. There were times, critical periods. And I found out in an airline magazine, where I get most of my information, that in Chinese, the word for crisis is the intersection of 2 of their ideograms. One is danger and the other is opportunity. And I think that that's quite interesting concerning the Liturgy of the Hours as prayer during critical times, that it is a danger and it is an opportunity. For perhaps one day the sleeping God may awake, or the waking God take notice. It is a time of danger. that our prayer may carry our souls to the utmost rim of life where we can never return. But it is a time of opportunity, an opportunity to come together and be God's people and celebrate the great deeds of God happening to us. These prayers in Judaism were related to light. Prayers at the rising of the sun and prayers at its setting. And they were taken over and reinterpreted by Christians in relationship to the Christian story, especially through the Johannine thematology of light. And so in the morning when Christians gathered, they did things that were usual for the morning. What you would find in early Christian prayer for the morning would be themes of creation, themes of recreation, rebirth, renewal, freshness, praise. What you would find in the evening would be suitable for the evening: relaxation, repentance, thanksgiving. As it says in Benedict's rule, we must pray the Lord's Prayer at least 3 times a day to expunge the scandals of community living. So in the evening you need to pray for the repentance, expunging all of the evils of the day. For Christians to pray morning and evening is part, I think, of the Christian psyche. I think that it has not so much a definitive connection with Hebrew forms of prayer, but just with the ordinary experience of human prayer. You find in all sorts of religions the need to pray morning and evening. And it came clear to me when I thought about my grandmother. My grandmother used to ask me when she'd come to visit whether I said my morning and my night prayers. And I would say to her, I always say my night prayers. And she'd say, that's not what I asked. And I said, well, you know, I don't like to get up in the morning. If I had my way, I like to get up around the crack of noon. And she said, but you have to, because that's what Christians do. And she said, well, what you are to do from now on is take your shoes and throw them way under the bed, so that in the morning when you get down on your knees to retrieve your shoes, you will remember that Christians pray. My grandmother knew nothing about the Liturgy of the Hours, but she did know something about being a Christian, and she did know something about what had been transmitted through our history of being Christian, of turning to God morning and evening at crisis times. Is the Liturgy of the Hours worth restoring? I think that it is, because it challenges our view of time. It says to us, time is not product. It says to us, time is gift. It says that we are not the ones who conquer time, but time is given to us by God. And it talks to us about the coming reign of God. And it speaks to us about how God's reign is happening and what we need to do to push that reign forward and reorient the meaning of our days. I'm going to stop. It's 10:24. We're supposed to go till 10:30, but we started a little early. Would you like to ask me some questions before 10:30? I can talk very well about time, but I still have one of these terrible watches that measures things minutely. Did that make some sense? I'll talk more practically about what you do with all that.
You spend a lot of time in positive emphasis on morning and evening prayer. When we hear more about the other hours, we can
I will talk a little bit about them, a little bit, and you can ask me any questions you want about them. And you'll certainly know what my prejudices are by the end of the day. I think it will come out pretty clearly. I have a couple handouts for you when we go rapidly through the history. The tradition of prayer basically is that the morning and evening hours were the key hours, or as the general instruction says, they are the cardinal hours of prayer, the hinge hours of prayer. The problem with the general instruction, though, is that it hedges. And it says these are the chief hours of prayer and they need to be observed by all of God's people. But then as you keep reading through it, it says, but of course, these other hours are really nice, and you'll surely like these. And by the way, if you're ordained, you had damn well better pray all of them. So when push comes to shove, they opt for the principle of obligation, which had originated not at all as obligation to individual recitation, but it was always obligation to the choral office, which devolved upon those who had entered a religious community of monks or nuns, those in, quote, solemn vows. So the obligation which develops originally with Basilian fraternities in Cappadocia in the 4th century, that obligation was not to the hours per se, but the obligation was to be with the community when the community prayed. That gets transmuted through all sorts of quirks of history, and of course, as you can well imagine, one of the governing factors here is money, with the giving of benefices and money for the saying of the office. And so Thomas Aquinas, when he comments on it, puts it under the virtue of justice, and then distinguishes that we have an obligation towards God because we're critters of creatures. And then he says, and of course, it's a matter of justice if you've collected funds for doing this, or land or whatever. But originally, the obligation was never to individual recitation. Never. In fact, in the Basilian fraternities, if somebody would go to Basil and say, well, geez, I missed prayer at the 3rd hour. Shall I make it up? Basil would have laughed in his face and said, well, no, of course you can't make it up because the 3rd hour is already past. So we come out of it's a quite different mentality.